Wow. I want to thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Actually, with the year I've had, it's a great pleasure to be anywhere. The good news is that in January, when the surgeon took out this lung, he promised me it was the one with the hot air in it. And so hopefully you won't be getting hot air from me today. This presentation is really about a journey that I've taken, but it's also a journey that many of you have taken, and a journey that is really for the benefit of all the children worldwide who have the benefit of being in environments that you have helped shape and design. And it starts with a premise that is all too often the case, certainly when I was growing up, which is that from the student's perspective, school sucked. And what I decided to do was some research on how long this had been the case. Was this a new thing or was it an old thing? And I found this painting that was done in about 1350 of a classroom in the University of Bologna. And if you look closely at this picture, you'll see in the third row students sleeping. You'll see students talking to each other. There's one goody two-shoes in the front row who's paying attention. But what we see from this painting is that school has sucked since 1350. Now, it seems to me that we've had lots of transformations in pedagogical thought and lots of opportunities to change things, but that classroom is not too different from the classrooms I grew up in, and that, I think, really makes a strong point, and the point is that place matters, something that is the foundation of your organization. Now, this is not what my classroom looked like, but this was the generation before mine. Kids sitting in nice desks, and in many cases, these desks were bolted to the floor. Some of you may know that the spacing between the desks was determined by the width of a custodian's broom. And that was to make it easy to clean the classroom at the end of the day. Doesn't seem to me that that should be the dominant issue, but that's the case. When I went to school, I was the beneficiary of research that showed that every child was right-handed. Okay? And I was disadvantaged as a child. I had a learning disability. I was left-handed. But no problem, because I had a teacher who was going to fix that. And so what she did was she took my belt and she tied my left hand to my leg so that I was forced to write with my right hand. And the result of that was actually kind of interesting. I became ambidextrously dysgraphic. And people couldn't read my handwriting. Only one solution for that: get a PhD. Because everybody knows you can't read your doctor's handwriting. And so you see, it all worked out in the end. But what an interesting statement that a piece of furniture shaped learning experiences. And we didn't know this. Lots of people thought it was obvious, but not enough. One of the people who did understand all of this very well, two people, Harold Rugg and Ann Shoemaker, who wrote this book, A Child-Centered School. And every time I mention this book, the 5 remaining copies get sucked up off the internet real fast. This book was written in the 1920s. And the whole premise of this book is that school matters. The design of the building matters. And this is not new information. There was a wonderful book on this. Rugg was one of Dewey's students. And so he was very much one of the leaders of the progressive education movement. If you're ever at the university in New York at the Teachers College, there you'll see that they have his papers in their archives, and you can read his work. It's quite fascinating work. And then I was talking a week or so ago with Erica Compton, because she said something a few years back that really struck a note with me. She said libraries need to become more like kitchens and less like grocery stores, a place where patrons are able to construct knowledge, where they can create, build, and make, and be actively engaged. And she is now one of the leaders of a statewide STEM coalition, Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math, for the state of Idaho. A very great person. Encourage you to check her out. Now, her background is not as an architect or a designer, but as somebody who is looking through the eyes of librarians and teachers as to what works in the classroom. My own journey started on this topic some years back, many years ago. I was attending a conference at the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C., and every presenter at this conference was what we call a picture card. Okay, we had Arthur C. Clarke coming live by satellite from Sri Lanka. We had senators. We had science fiction people. We had people who were talking about the future of education through the eyes of futurists themselves. And it was an amazing conference. The problem was they didn't schedule any breaks. There was a break for lunch and a break for dinner, and the conference ran for 2 days. And what I noticed was, after about an hour and a half, people got up, few people would get up, go use the facilities, and instead of coming back, they would stop in a hallway and talk to each other, even though that meant that they were missing some pretty exciting presentations that were going on. And at night, that first night, I was in my hotel room reflecting on the day, and it hit me that there are 3 things that these people were experiencing, but the structure of the event didn't allow for 3 things to happen. So the event itself provided what we call campfires, lectures, presentations of information. That's fine. But these people needed time to talk to their colleagues about what they were learning, and I called that the watering hole. And then they needed time to reflect, and I called that the cave. And so the idea of campfires, watering holes, and caves, which was where I had gotten by the end of this conference, started because of this experience. Now, I got back to California, where I lived at the time, talked to a cross-cultural anthropologist and other people who studied different cultures, and realized that, among other things, I was missing the 4th space, which is the application space. Where do you take what you have learned and apply it and create something with it? And we decided to call that space life. So when we break this down in terminology that teachers relate to, the campfire's the didactic space, the place where I'm giving you a presentation right now. The watering hole is the social constructivist place associated typically with Lev Vygotsky. If you're a teacher familiar with his work, what we call the watering hole, that's where you share ideas. At conferences, that's typically the exhibit hall. If you have exhibit halls at conferences, you see a lot of people just talking to each other as they're looking at exhibits and sharing what they've learned or what they think about, that kind of stuff. The cave is the home of the cognitive constructivism. Again, if you're an educator, you'll think of people like Piaget associated with that. And life as the, is the application space associated with Seymour Papert, late of MIT, who coined the word constructionism. And he says, doesn't matter if you're building a sandcastle or a theory of the universe, you know something when you can build an artifact that can be shared with other people. And so we came up with these 4 learning spaces, and that influenced a couple of books, including my most recent one, From the Campfire to the Holodeck. So the Campfire is the home of the storyteller. It's a place that people have gathered around for millennia. And certainly before the written language came into existence, there was a lot of education going on, and it took place around that. The watering hole, where people found out what's going on in their village or the adjacent village, that's still a very important place for people in some parts of the world. This is what a watering hole looked like at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, where I spent the 1970s. And what's interesting about this particular group of people, without going into details as to who they are, they were just working on different projects and sharing ideas with each other about these projects. After they left Xerox, one of these people left and started a company called Electronic Arts, a major video game company. Other people went to Microsoft, other people went other places. I'd say the average net worth of the people sitting in that group right there is probably $200–300 million or more. So pretty bright group of people. And maybe this type of learning environment was something that played a role. Who knows? We don't know. This is a photograph of the Illinois Math and Science Academy in Aurora, Illinois. This is a watering hole that they have right in the middle of the hallway, where students can just go and talk to each other and convene outside the classroom. It's a very nice space for them. The cave is a reflective space. It's where you go and you think about things deeply. Caves have played an important role for human beings for millennia. And this is what a cave looks like at a school in Poughkeepsie. This school was designed by Fielding Nair, and very interesting environment. At the Barrington Public Library, Barrington, Illinois, they have similar types of places in the children's section of the library where kids can cocoon and just reflect on stuff. Maybe read a book or do something else, but just really be alone with their thoughts. And so I think that's interesting to see in application. And then constructionist spaces. These students are building their own classroom. At the beginning of the year, this particular school in San Francisco starts with an empty room and big piles of lumber and whatnot, and the students get to decide literally what their classroom is going to look like and build it. So I think that's a little extreme personally, but I think it's an interesting idea nonetheless. In workshops, I've given teachers opportunity to design their own classrooms using things they can find in the IKEA catalog. And this teacher wanted to have chairs that are suspended from the ceiling that kids could sit in and be cocooned. She wanted a tumbling mat in the middle of the floor where kids could stretch out and read. She's an English teacher, and she had a fireplace because Michigan City, Indiana, where this was, gets cold in the winter, and she wanted a private place so she could work one-on-one with kids without drawing attention to a child's learning needs by the rest of the class. Interesting idea. This is a design school in Mexico City that's doing some interesting stuff around school design and around architecture. Some of the faculty there are involved, and I'm sure members of this organization. Francesco Missori in Amsterdam is doing some interesting school design based on some of these ideas, and some of these are implemented in some neat ways. And there are many, many others. I couldn't give you a laundry list of people who have done their design this way. The book that was just talked about up here goes into a lot of that with people from all over the world. And so these ideas of flexible learning spaces that includes not just the buildings, but the furniture and everything else are not new ideas, but we're providing some type of language that people can gravitate around and explain in simple terms why this is of benefit to the kids. And to me, an ideal school is one that kids are clamoring to get into before school opens in the morning and are really upset when they have to leave in the afternoon. And I had the pleasure of doing work in a school in Brazil, in Recife, Brazil, where we had implemented some of this stuff. And in the way the school's set up is that the morning is all the academics. I couldn't mess much with that, but the afternoon is free. And so we did workshops around around building things. And students, just clamored for that. And the first time I did one of these things, got to be 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I said, okay, kids, you got to go home. Your parents are waiting for you downstairs. We were supposed to finish around 4, so you really need to go now. And they said, oh, please, come I stay. And I said, no, I have a life too, So please leave. Nothing's going to be touched. You can come back tomorrow and keep working on this. And finally, we got them out of the building. But I thought, was that a bad thing or a good thing? I choose to think that was a good thing. Because when you create environments that are engaging and exciting and inviting, that's going to really be of benefit to everyone. And the educators are refreshed when they're in an environment like that. I mean, teaching is hard work. I mean, when you go to bed at night as a teacher, you don't go to sleep, you pass out. I mean, it is tough. And when you can have a made environment that supports the wonderful things you want to do with children, boy, life gets so much easier. So much easier. So we decided to look in the pedagogical side of things, and a lot of talk in this country a few years back about the flipped classroom. The idea behind the flipped classroom was that students would do their academic stuff at home and then come to school, and in school they did what would have normally been the homework, but they do it with the teacher's guidance and whatnot. And I decided to push that envelope a little bit. So my wife Norma and I created a series of 50 inquiry starters that we called Nights of Knowledge. And we had these videos, they're about 1 minute in length. And what the videos did was they set up a challenge. And the challenge was across different subject areas. For example, what impact, if any, did popular music have on the Vietnam War? That's an interesting question. Why is it that spiral galaxies and hurricanes have the same patterns? Why is that? And by the way, Google isn't going to help you a whole lot. It's not that you could just do a quick Google search and have the answer to those questions. You got to do some research. You have to think about it. And we posted these. They were used by a lot of people. And then the Wurana School in near Melbourne created what they called the Enigma projects, where the students themselves are asking these kinds of questions and doing the research, and they're having great success with it. And I've got these videos. The website has gone down because nobody was using it, but I have these all on my Google Drive, and I'll send you the address, anybody who wants these, give them to your educator friends to try out. But the principle is that all too often, when teachers ask a question, they want to blurt out the answer. And they need to have support to know when it's not appropriate to do that, because they might be stealing an opportunity for the students to make really profound discoveries on their own. And I had this happen in São Paulo, Brazil one time. I was doing a workshop at an American school, and I showed a picture of a Portuguese church in Lisbon that was built in the 1200s. And it's very obvious when you look at the church that it looks like a fort also. And so the question is, why did the churches built at that time in Europe, in Portugal in particular, resemble forts? And there was a history teacher sitting right about where you are who said, well, it was because of the, I said, don't say that word. He said, but it was the, I said, don't say it. He said, it was the Moors, damn it. I said, you just stole from a kid. You stole an opportunity for the child to make that discovery and to learn more about it. I said, do you teach your kids, when you teach about the Moors, do you teach that the Christians and the Moors and the Jews lived in harmony in Barcelona for 200 years? No, I don't get to that. I said, what's the likelihood that kids researching this would find that out? He said, pretty high. I said, so? See my point? He didn't. He doesn't teach there anymore, but as a teacher, those of us who are teachers are proud of our own knowledge, and we should be. But just because we're proud of it doesn't mean that that gives us the right to blurt it out to everybody. Just a thought, sorry. Making stuff. Oh, is that, that's become such a big topic. I mean, the buzzword a couple of years ago was maker spaces. And every school's got to have a maker space and whatnot. Well, I mean, yeah, but we should never have stopped making stuff. That's the big thing. I mean, when I was a kid, we had craft programs in school, and those went bye-bye. But now it's coming back. This is a tool called MakerBits, based on the BBC microbit, that makes it very easy for kids to do very complex projects on anything. They can build servo mechanisms, they can build pH meters, they can build whatever they want. These tools make it possible for kids, starting with just this piece of hardware and software that they themselves write, build wonderful stuff. And we're seeing more of this coming into schools, this kind of programming that's involved in this sort of technology. And it's very simple block-based programming, very easy to do. These kids did a water purification system based on this technology and recycled materials. Very interesting stuff. 3D printing has become big, not as big as I thought it would be, mostly because it's so slow, but who knows, that'll get fixed. But 3D printing is coming about. There's a new 3D printer coming on the market later this year that has a conveyor belt, and what it allows a teacher to do is to queue up 30 jobs, let's say, and then as the parts get finished, they fall into a basket. So you can start the thing at night, come back the next day, and all the kids' projects are done. Because some of these things take a couple hours to build. That's pretty cool, right? But this is a more traditional type of 3D printer. And you can make marvelous things and design marvelous things. And the tools are there in the hands of kids to do really amazing stuff. But just because we've got new spaces doesn't mean the students are going to be taught any differently. And the school leadership plays a critical role. We have to get the administrators really on board, really engaged to do this, because otherwise what will happen is people will just revert to what they're comfortable with. And I'll tell you, in the United States, it's a huge issue because of these bloody standardized tests that everybody's scared of. Even though it's been shown that when kids have more freedom to explore subjects, they do better on these tests than if they're just taught to the test, people are afraid because it's a big, issue for a school to not be ranked properly and whatnot. But this can be fixed, and I've talked to some people today who have told me that you're doing that. When you go and design projects or go to bid on projects, that you'll talk with the school about these issues and maybe do some workshops on project-based learning or things of that sort to help the teachers so that when they get the new school, they're going to be able to use it in the most efficient and wonderful way. And you take a look at the schools that exist that were built 100 years ago. There's a lot of them still around. And I was thinking one time that when we first motorized a carriage, got rid of horses, we called it a horseless carriage, right? But how did we go from the horseless carriage to the automobile? Think about that for a second. An automobile doesn't look like a horseless carriage. A horseless carriage looks like a horseless carriage, right? And when the automobile became dominant, did that lead to other things like suburbs, interstate highways? I mean, all of the impact of just shifting from the horse-drawn world to the motorized world of today. Well, this is the same opportunity we've got in education to think about when we build these new buildings, they're going to last for hundreds of years. Are they going to be able to support the needs of children who are growing into a future that is completely different from the one in which we grew up? It's just something for us to think about. One of my clients is a school in Aurora, Illinois, Illinois Math and Science Academy. I showed you one picture I took of the atrium area where they have this conversational space. And I'll tell you a quick background story on them. This school had a dropout. Now, this is a residential public high school, and normally kids don't drop out because once you leave, you can't come back, and also everybody's going to college from there anyway. But this one kid wanted to start a company, and they said, we don't have a way that you can start a company and stay in school. And he said, well, then I'm going to drop out. And he did. So he dropped out of school, and then after he and his partner sold YouTube for $1 billion, he came back and said, can I help you with anything? And they said, yes. We'd like to make it possible for kids to start companies and not drop out of school. He said, what can I do to help? And one of the things they built is this Into Center, Into, which is kind of a pun, but it's also innovation and invention. And this center has, the way it operates, the school only has academic classes 4 days a week, and then 1 day a week the students are free to work on their own projects. So right away that's breaking a mold in some cool ways. This area, the N2 Center, supports some presentations, campfire kind of environment. This maker lounge, they call it, is a conversational space. Also, sometimes you can hole up there yourself, so in that respect it becomes a little cave-like. And then they have the life space where you actually build things, and they've got all kinds of tools, anything you could imagine there. And it's quite successful. And then once students get their ideas to a point that they're ready to do something with it, they have an incubator, a series of offices in downtown Chicago in the Merchandise Mart, where students have little offices and they can continue to work on their projects. They have venture capitalists who also have their offices on that floor of the building themselves to come help kids write business plans. I mean, they've really thought this through. So who knows where the next big companies are going to come from, although I'm betting on some of these kids as being the creators of them. So interesting. And academically, their program is spectacular. But I wanted to go beyond that. I wanted to create one learning environment that encompassed everything. And I thought, well, you know, the two words that were important for me was immersion and interaction. And one of the places that's really good at doing that's down the street called Disneyland. And they have this mission to space activity where 4 kids get strapped into this immersive system, and they have to take off their spacecraft and land it on another planet. And I thought, okay, I'm going to give this a try. And I was actually down in Orlando, and my wife and I were there with 2 of our friends from Brazil, and I said, okay, let's do this. My wife said, you know what, I'm going to meet you in the gift shop. You guys go ahead. Because they have a sign that says, if you even know somebody with a heart disease, don't ride this. And I thought, oh, how tough can this be? Come on. And so 3 of us got strapped in, but it really needs 4 people because, you know, everybody has things to do. And it's very hard, by the way, to land a spacecraft when the person next to you is screaming, "We're all going to die," in Portuguese. But in any event, we made it. And I thought, well, this is neat, but it only handles 4 kids at a time. We need more than that. Google created a virtual environment based on Google Earth that can handle 8 people at a time, still not enough. And then I thought, hey, you know, Star Trek, Next Generation, they had, this is from another series, but had the Holodeck. And Holodeck can accommodate as many people as you need, right? So I'm going to build me a Holodeck. Never mind the technical details. And it's not going to be a real Holodeck yet. But the idea was to create something that supported all 4 learning spaces. So I had got a school to give me a room, and we had 3 projectors facing the front as a viewport. We had a touch screen on the side for a control panel. We had lighting along the walls that could change the color of the room or put images on the walls. And then, of course, we did have some real furniture in there. And this environment was immersive, interactive, interdisciplinary, innovative, and interesting. And it all led to engagement. So the first mission that we did was how to deal with the concept of something living. And so we decided to do a mission to Mars, the search for life, and we did a brief setup for the challenge. Percival Lowell, an astronomer, had identified what he thought were canals on Mars. That's actually, he was looking at reflections of his own veins in his eyes, but that's okay. He thought they looked like canals. And then more recently, the Allen Hills meteorite from Mars was discovered. And what's interesting about this meteorite is a section of it was put under scanning electron microscope. My father, who was a bacteriologist, I got him this picture and other pictures similar to it. And I said, Dad, I said, what are you looking at? He said, well, he said, given the dimensions and everything, he said, it looks like a fossilized nanobacillus. And he said, I've never seen a bacteria of this size before. Where's it from? And I said, Mars. And he said, huh. Which spoke volumes. And so I said, yeah, well. And by the way, the research done since that time has lent even more strength to that allegation that at one time Mars had bacteria. Also, when the rover was scraping the surface, they found ice and they found salt, which shows that at one time Mars had margaritas. So again, I mean, you don't argue with the data, you know. Also, adding to this is that in the northern hemisphere of Mars in the summertime, at the base of some of the larger volcanoes, there's this emission of about 16,000 metric tons of methane. Now, if you do a back of the envelope calculation of how many cows it takes to produce 16,000 metric tons of methane, it's quite a few. Although this probably didn't come from cows, but it may very likely have come from decaying vegetable matter of some sort that's underneath the surface of Mars, which is one of the reasons that Mars is now actively being searched for more evidence of that it had life. So I said, okay, well, let's do a mission. And our spacecraft, starting out at Earth, was going to go to Mars, and we wanted to have the kids decide what skills they thought would be needed on this mission, what teams they should form. They had to research their team topics, and then they had an app on their iPads that let them go around the spacecraft and do different things. And then as the mission started, early on into the mission, all of a sudden the hull of the spacecraft was breached with a piece of debris, space debris. This is a photograph of real space debris hole. And they had to plug that hole. Fortunately, they had a 3D printer. And so they could design a plug to plug the hole, and then they had to do that quickly because we're losing air. And I was giving a presentation on this at the International Space Development Conference some years back, and there were a couple of people in the audience who said, you know, 3D printers for space would be good. And they started a company called Made in Space. And in fact, on the space station right now is a 3D printer. And that grew out from the work done by the people who attended my talk, which was kind of cool. And I have all the t-shirts I want, you know, they just load me up with them. The kids involved in this were very engaged, very actively engaged. And here's a view out the viewport. Obviously, we're still by Earth. And then on the left side is this touch screen that I talked about. And this one uses a pen, not your finger, but she's doing manipulation of something. And then as we get to Mars, there's a radiation blast from the sun, and the students have to protect themselves from this. And so the question is how to do it, and they decided to move around to let Mars block the thing. So they were on the dark side. And of course it gets very dark in the room as they move the spacecraft the backside of Mars. And then they hear the radiation detector going. And one girl got up and sat next to a friend of hers. And I said, are you okay, sweetie? And she said, I'm scared. And I thought, yes, we did it. You know, suspension of disbelief, that's what it was about, and whatnot. I said, you'll be okay. Here's some kids who are, again, looking at Mars and comparing what they're seeing. And I asked these kids, I said, what are you looking at? And they said, Mars. I said, where is Mars? And they said, it's right there, right out the window. Okay, okay, good, yes. So everything here is student-directed, and it's in an environment that is operated by computers, and because of that, we can do anything in the holodeck. For example, we looked into, I didn't build this one, but going back to the period before the continents had split apart, especially in Brazil, because I was doing so much work in Brazil at the time, the fossils being found on the east coast of Brazil are of the same species that are being found on the west coast of Africa. Well, that's because they were all part of the same landmass at one time, and the landmass shifted. So the idea was, well, let's build an environment for students to explore that world. And I thought, well, this is going to be a really cool project, because if you go back to that time and you're in a primordial forest, what does it smell like, right? I mean, we don't do a lot with smell intentionally. I said, man, you know, if we had little heaters, which I made, and little oils, scented oils, we could simulate any smell we wanted and whatnot. So I thought, well, we've got decaying plants and we've got dinosaur poop. I just had to guess on the dinosaur poop what it smelled like, but and so we were able to build that part. And then I thought, well, as the dinosaurs walk by this time machine that has taken us back there, this thing's going to shake because these guys are big, right? And so we thought about erecting a floor that had springs that we could control electromagnetically, you know, to vibrate the room. And it turns out the room I was given was right next door to the library. And the librarian said, Mars is fine, this is not fine. So we didn't build it. But it's a thought, free to anybody who wants to try it. One of the people who's I'm working with, Francesco Missori, he's an architect in Amsterdam, is designing holodecks now in corporate settings as well as educational ones, because any place, anytime you want to simulate something, why not have it happen in a totally immersive environment, sort of a concept. So anyway, that's just a brief overview of my journey. There's my email address. I encourage you to touch base. And at this point, I would like to spend the next few minutes handling questions as long as they do not involve the impeachment in the U.S. right now. I mean, we have 10 minutes, not 10 hours. Yes, anyone with questions? There are people with microphones walking by. That's okay.
What's the most important thing?
The most important thing is putting the kids first when you're designing a school. That was an easy one. Ah, there you go.
What science fiction writers do you recommend?
Oh, Neil Stephenson. I particularly like him. And he wrote a book called Snow Crash, which I think is begging to be turned into a movie. And the pizza delivery scene in the opening section will probably get an Oscar. But yeah, I like him, and of course Gibson is another one up there. But Neil Stephenson is my favorite. And what's interesting about him is I believe he's got a PhD in physics or something. I mean, the guy is highly educated person, so he gets the science right. Well, as right as he can, given his constraints. But yeah, how about you? Who do you like? Okay.
Ursula Le Guin.
What's that?
Ursula Le Guin.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. No, here it comes. There's another microphone.
You have worked here and in Brazil, and based on the institutions, is United States or Brazil institutions more acceptable to project-based learning or different type of alternative learning?
Brazil went through a period 3 presidents ago that was very open to that. During the military time, the public schools were pretty much destroyed because it's easier to maintain a dictatorship with an uneducated populace. And so when Fernando Henrique was president of Brazil, his wife did a lot of work with good pedagogical thinkers from all over the world, and they crafted a new education plan that was implemented then. It was beautiful. Then we got a not so good president, another not so good president who got impeached, and now we have a president who calls himself Trump of the tropics. And that does not bode well, in my view, for Brazil's vision of education. And we've gone through some changes here, and I'm not as hopeful as I'd like to be. But what I do know is that even though this can be a lonely business, as long as we stick together, we can make things happen, all right? We can do it. And we can do it with the support or without the support of the government. We can make it happen because schools are still community's responsibility. And that, to me, is that's the key to a good solution. But Brazil has taken a couple of steps backwards recently, and I'm hopeful that that will turn around. But you know, I'm not holding my breath, as they say. But good question. Very good question. And where are you from?
Brazil.
Okay, and you, what's,
Most of my work is here.
okay, and where in Brazil?
Nós em Salvador, Bahia.
Oh, Bahia, yeah. Moro em Recife. Yeah, yes,
Também não fala português?
mais ou menos. Sorry. Yeah, my Portuguese isn't as good as it should be, but it's, yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to jump back to the caves, campfires, and watering holes. I think we've all become sort of conversant in those terms, and you mentioned that you added the life piece to that.
Right.
I was wondering if you have had other thoughts about those in the intervening years, or if you've seen, for example, things that work well or don't work as well for particular ones of those. Like, is there a type of cave that works particularly well or not well?
Yeah, the answer, the short answer to that is I have not, I've thought about this a lot, especially prior to doing my newest book. And I feel good about those because they tie into established pedagogical models. And I think that the challenge, as I said at the beginning, is that we need to have the support staff at a school, the superintendent, the principals, who are really buying into the appreciation of these learning modalities, and then trust the teachers to because we're not all ready for a lecture at the same time. You know, we're not all ready to work in groups at the same time. And that is a real conundrum, especially when you have 30 kids in a classroom. And so how do you craft an environment that lets people be where they need to be? And I have the good fortune of working with two schools. One of them is a K-6 school, and the other is the high school that I mentioned, IMSA, where they've managed to do that. But IMSA is a bad example because those kids are pre-selected to be there, and the faculty is very clearly selected to be there. And so it's a challenge. It's a challenge, but I think it's one we can all rise to. That said, within each of those, I mean, for example, I didn't do a space relating to outdoor education, but outdoor education applies to those learning spaces also. I mean, I remember when I was teaching at Stanford, and Bucky Fuller had passed away, and I did a eulogy speech from inside a tensegrity sculpture that they had on campus. And I climbed up into this with my grad students around to talk about his mathematics because I was surrounded by it, and so I could, you know, point to different things. I started with 20 kids and ended up with about 75. Because they were just walking along campus. What's that crazy guy doing in there? And the campus police were not thrilled that I was touching the sculpture. Well, too bad. But the point was there was a campfire taking place outdoors. And I think that all of these other environments that we use in our designs and that we love and respect have to be part of that equation. So it's not, campfires, watering holes, caves in life is part of the story. It's not the whole story. And I never pretended for it to be the whole story. This elementary school I work with raises chickens. And they grow their own vegetables and whatnot. And the eggs and the vegetables are cooked up by the cafeteria workers. And that's because they've got a delightfully crazy superintendent. And she and I are very good friends, and it's just what she loves. And the kids love it too, because they have the opportunity. And that's an ordinary public school. Doesn't get any more money than anybody else. Half the kids at that school are children of migrant farm workers. The other half are children of the executives of Abbott Laboratories. So it's quite an interesting mix of kids. Everybody thrives. So it could happen. Thank you.